On episode 2 of this podcast, I attempted to explain to my friend Aaron Bandler the type of fermentation controller that I use for my setup. Then a couple of days later, John Beeler reached out and agreed to do the show. John is the creator of the Fermentrack software, the Raspberry Pi based temperature controller forked from BrewPi. I felt our conversation was something I had to share, so we're going to take on Fermentrack again today on Homebrewing DIY. Have you ever wanted to make a podcast? Do you have a subject you want to discuss with listeners? Do you even know where to start? Well, if you want to make a podcast and you want to get started now, I could not recommend Anchor enough. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your phone or computer. Creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast so it sounds great. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard everywhere: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. And you can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hey, look, I shopped around for a place to post my podcast, and Anchor was the easiest, most streamlined experience you could ask for. So if you're looking for a place for your new podcast, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Once again, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And welcome back to Homebrewing DIY, the podcast that takes on the do-it-yourself aspect of homebrewing. Gadgets, contraptions, and parts, this podcast covers it all. Today we're talking with John Beeler, the creator of Fermentrack. This is yet another Raspberry Pi project geared around fermentation based on the legacy BrewPi project. John is going to talk with us about his thinking in building Fermentrack and how you can build one yourself. Please support the podcast by clicking on the support link in the description. Your support helps this podcast stay on the air and helps the show get better. You can give to this podcast monthly, and any amount will help. You can just use the link anchor.fm/homebrewingdiy/support. If you support us at the $4.99 level or higher, I will send you a brand new shiny Homebrewing DIY logo sticker just for saying thanks. Another way to support the podcast is to review us on Stitcher and Apple Podcasts. Your review helps other homebrewers find this show. If you're looking for homebrewing software to build your recipes or just want to try something new, please try our sponsor, BrewFather. BrewFather is a great free version, and it's very easy to use and has a ton of features. You can support the podcast by going to our website, homebrewingdiy.beer, and clicking on the BrewFather banner. Give it a try. It's some really great, powerful software. Do you have feedback for the show? Is there a subject you want us to cover? Have you built something great and you'd like to share? Shoot me an email at podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. I would love to hear from you, and I'd love to share your feedback. John Beeler created an amazing web interface for the BrewPi project, and he's agreed to come on the show and share his thinking for building Fermentrack. I present you with John Beeler and Fermentrack. I'd like to welcome John Beeler to the show to discuss a really cool project that I personally use for my fermentation chamber, which is Fermentrack. John is the creator of Fermentrack. He forked it from the original BrewPi project, and I'd like to introduce him to Homebrewing DIY. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. I think what we should do is let's just start with your thinking of why you decided to fork the BrewPi project and create your own version of a fermentation controller.
Sure. So what's interesting is so if you think about the BrewPi project, there's three main components to the BrewPi project. There is the hardware controller, which is running a BrewPi compatible firmware. There is a web-based application, so there's like a web front end, and then there's a script that communicates between the two. Now, what actually, like when I was developing Fermentrack, I actually was doing it as a way of better integrating a hardware controller that I was working on. So what I'd actually done was I had gone and was working on a separate project called Fuscus, which is done by a guy named Andrew Arrington. And what he had decided to do was to try and take the BrewPi controller and rebuild it in straight Python. So the idea would be that you could pick up a Raspberry Pi and with very little additional hardware, get that so that it would be able to run something similar to the BrewPi firmware and control a fridge directly. And I thought this was a great approach. This was something that was really interesting to me. Less is more in that case. And so if I was going to be able to leverage that project to then go and run my fermentation chamber, I wouldn't have to pick up any of the other stuff that would be associated with BrewPi. Got involved in that project, and at the same time decided to build a sprinkler system that I had used an ESP8266 controller for, and thought, about 6 months after I built that sprinkler system, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I could run the BrewPi firmware on an ESP8266? And so I went and over the course of about a month and a half, 2 months, built it. And once I'd done that, I said, wow, this is really neat. Wouldn't it be cool if rather than having it so that my BrewPi controller had to be connected to the same or to a Raspberry Pi running the BrewPi web interface, wouldn't it be cool, like using a cable, wouldn't it be cool if I could do this over Wi-Fi? And so then I went and edited the script and got it so that it would work over Wi-Fi, and then realized, wow, getting this thing to work in the BrewPi web interface is a massive pain. And that was the point in time at which I said, there's got to be a better way to do this. Let me go ahead and see if I can come up with a better solution. So that's when I decided to go and try and build Fermentrack. So I think one of the things that tends to get lost in a lot of discussions around Fermentrack is that Fermentrack is a replacement for the web interface for BrewPi. It is not the actual controller or anything else. It's designed so that it can support whatever BrewPi compatible hardware you want to throw at it, be it my project that started it all, the ESP8266 version, be it the original BrewPi firmware, be it the one that you discussed a few weeks ago, so Lee Bussey's BrewPi Remix, or even one of the official actual BrewPi controllers like Elko created. It also supports other hardware like the tilt, the gravity sensor, the homebrew version, the iSpindle, or even if you wanted to just go ahead and make manual fermentation notes, it even supports that.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is that the script that's being pushed over to the microcontroller is essentially the same one that Elko wrote with the BrewPi, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's what's actually running the PID in the system, but the web interface is what is different in Fermentrack. And what of the web interface that you were trying to fix? Like, for example, they are very different. Even the graphing is different. What was it about the BrewPi interface that you didn't like? What were you trying to actually fix?
So one of the things that was really interesting when I first started looking into the BrewPi firmware was that something Elko had started to try and do but never finished implementing was this concept of having a single controller control multiple fermentation chambers or control multiple beers. And the idea was that within that controller, you could have it so that one piece of hardware would then control however many beers you wanted to ferment with it simultaneously. The problem is, even though he never finished building out that support, one thing I had found very confusing about the BrewPi web interface was it still required you to do things like specify which chamber you were trying to control, or which beer within that chamber you were trying to control. And if you didn't understand that you needed to specifically select this specific chamber or this specific beer, it would fail silently. And that was something that I had found really confusing. And so something that I had wanted to try and do from the start was to design Fermentrack in a way that was more intuitive, but also would provide the user with actionable feedback that would allow them to correct whatever it was that was preventing them from getting their fermentation controller up and running.
Okay, so you're the actionable feedback. So, like, for example, if there is an error, it's telling you what that error is. That kind of feedback.
Exactly. So one of the screens that I'm actually proudest of is one that hopefully most people only see once or twice during an install of Fermentrack. If you actually click into the settings page on Fermentrack, it's got a grid of icons that are color coded to show you what pieces of the system you've set up and what the implication is of not having that piece set up or active, in terms of how that will impact your overall your experience with the system. There are elements that are completely optional in a normal BrewPi setup, like, for example, measuring what the temperature of the room is. That's not going to have any impact on your beer whatsoever. It's just more of an informational thing. But then there are things that may seem like they're not important, but are actually critical. So if you're building a BrewPi setup in order to control the temperature of a beer that you're fermenting, you may think, well, hey, the temperature of the fridge that the beer is in isn't really relevant. However, that actually is critical to the PID algorithm. And if you don't have that set, it will result in you not having a functioning controller. So providing that feedback to the user up front, making it very obvious what it is that is available or is happening, and allowing them to then very quickly correct that and get to a position where they have a working setup was something that was very, very important to me.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the PID algorithm. Let's just assume whoever's listening to this doesn't know what that is. What's a good way of explaining how a PID works?
So if you think about it, right, if I have a bottle of beer, and the bottle of beer that I have is room temperature, and I stick that bottle of beer in a ice chest that's filled with ice, then generally I think most people have done that, and they know the beer doesn't freeze. The beer gets cold, but it doesn't freeze. The thing is that the same thing is true when you're trying to ferment something. If you take a fermenter that's full of beer and you stick it into a fridge and you set that fridge to a temperature of 32 degrees, beer is not going to freeze. It's not going to get all the way down to freezing temperature. What that means is that means that the temperature of the beer itself is, while it's dependent on the temperature of its surroundings, of the fridge or of the ice chest, you can't make the assumption that the temperature of its surroundings are the same as the temperature inside the beer. What a PID algorithm attempts to do is it attempts to determine how changes to the temperature of the environment that your beer is in will impact the temperature of the beer itself, and therefore allow you to control the temperature of your beer by controlling the environment. What that means is if you decide that you want to ferment a beer at exactly 71.5 degrees Fahrenheit, using a PID algorithm, you can actually generally control it to about that degree of accuracy, even though your fridge is going to be cycling on and off, a couple times over the course of an hour, where it may not seem like you would be able to control it quite that tightly. So what it does is the utilization of a PID algorithm allows you to very tightly control an output, in this case, the temperature of your beer, by controlling the inputs, in this case, how often your fridge is on or off. Yeah,
and when you're looking at the graph there, that's the fridge set point or the heat set point, right? And is the variance between that and your beer temperature, right?
Exactly. So the idea is that I mean, fridge set point. If you're familiar with the BrewPi setup, then one of the things that's interesting on the graphs that a BrewPi will produce is it will show you, okay, you said that you wanted your beer to be at exactly 71.4 degrees Fahrenheit, but here's the temperature that I'm trying to target in order to be able to, like, for your fridge, in order to be able to keep your beer at that temperature. Again, in this case, what you're really saying is you're saying, I'm less concerned about the temperature of my fridge. I'm more concerned about the temperature of the beer. And that's what the algorithm really allows you to control for.
Exactly. And one of the cool features that I like about Fermentrack is the way that you handle profiling, right? So profiling the beer. Though the BrewPi could also do that, you have a different interface for that. What were you thinking in that difference in interface?
The honest answer to that is I never was able to figure out the BrewPi interface. And so I just said, fine, if I'm going to rebuild this, I might as well rebuild it in a way that makes sense to me. Really what the idea behind the way that I designed it was to try and make it as intuitive as possible. And so that's one of the reasons why one of the things that Fermentrack attempts to do is to represent a profile in multiple ways. So for anyone listening that hasn't used a BrewPi before, what a brew profile says is it allows you to say, all right, I know that when I pitch this yeast in my wort, that what's going to happen is that this yeast is going to go to town on it over the course of the first few days. There's going to be a little bit of a lag, but after 3 days, it's really going to be munching away on all those sugars. And then after about 7 days or so, it's going to have mostly munched through the majority of it. And by about day 10 or so, it'll be completely done. So I can say, all right, over the first few days, I want to keep the temperature relatively low. I don't want to produce a whole hell of a lot of esters and whatnot. I want to keep it pretty controlled. So I want to say, keep my beer at 76 degrees, or 72 degrees. Then, as it starts to drop off, and as most of the sugars have been consumed, I want it to go to town, and I want to try and clean up the beer a little bit. So I want to warm it up a little bit in order to help finish that beer off. So I want to go ahead and have it over the course of 3 days, starting about day 5. I want to go from 72 degrees to 76 degrees. Not too fast. I want to let it warm up a little bit, over time, but still want to be able to raise the temperature slowly. Then, starting about day 10, day 12, I want to start cold crashing. But again, I don't want to have a lot of suckback. So I don't want to have it where all of a sudden I go from 76 degrees down to 32 degrees. I want to have it so that temperature so that I'll slowly lower the temperature by, a degree or 2 per hour. And have it so that when all is said and done at the end of, say, day 14, it's now at my cold crash temperature. What BrewPi setups allow you to do is to create a profile that will do all of those temperature changes automatically without any user input. Within Fermentrack, what happens is as you're inputting the various set points, it will show you visually as well as through a text representation exactly what the profile you're specifying will accomplish. So it will show you that the temperature will be held level for 3 days at 72 degrees. It will show you the gradual ramp up over the course of a few days until it hits that 76 degree level. And then it will show you that gradual ramp down as you're cold crashing and tell you exactly what day your beer will finish.
It's pretty cool. And what new features have you added to Fermentrack that BrewPi doesn't have?
So one of the ones that, the most obvious one is support for Wi-Fi controllers that aren't set up via serial. Fermentrack allows you to very, very quickly attach new controllers, not have to go in, edit a bunch of files in order to do so. It allows you to set controllers up through a very intuitive interface, if I may say so myself. It also allows for the connection of things like specific gravity sensors, so the tilt hydrometer as one, the ice spindle is another. It allows for very easy beer profile sharing. So you can copy and paste beer profiles onto things like web forums, share them with people. Makes it much easier to take a profile somebody else has created and import it into the app. I'm trying to think, what else does it have?
I know that some of your most recent updates was the ability to export data to third-party sites.
Yeah, so it has the ability to cascade data down. We have one of the things that I'm in the process of working on is getting support built out for BrewFather, and finishing up and cleaning up the support for Brewer's Friend. The idea really is whatever applications you use is part of your pipeline. Fermentrack shouldn't really get in the way of that. It should allow you to maintain whatever data you collect from your sensors and over the course of your fermentation, and integrate that into your pipeline more broadly. So,
yeah. So an example would be, let's say I'm using BrewFather or Brewer's Friend. The data would then chart a graph attached to the recipe that I've been working on from the start, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What if I were, let's say I've never picked up a soldering iron. This is the first my first day looking at this. What are the things I need to get to build a Fermentrack?
So Fermentrack is actually pretty simple to get set up. So fundamentally, Fermentrack is just a web interface that runs on Python, and it can run on pretty much any setup that you have that can host a Python-based web interface. It was designed in part because of its the legacy of BrewPi. It was designed to run on a Raspberry Pi. So it's very simple if you don't have another host system to pick up a Raspberry Pi and very quickly install it. One of the nice things is that Fermentrack can be installed with one command. So once you have your Raspberry Pi up and running, you run that one command and everything else is taken care of for you. It also, for more advanced users or users that like to be a bit more experimental, it can actually be run on any other anything else that can run Python. So you could conceivably run it on a web server if you wanted to. I've heard of people running it in Docker or on virtual machines like that. You, in theory, could even run it in Windows if you really wanted to try and go down that path. Not suggesting it, I've never done it, but it could be done. If you're looking to try and build a BrewPi that would run in conjunction with Fermentrack, then that's where you really would have to start thinking about picking up a soldering iron. Again, for the project that I support, so the ESP8266 port of BrewPi, I think it's fairly straightforward, but it does require some light soldering, as well as some comfort level working with mains power. You would be building a power controller that would turn on and off your fridge, so you have to be comfortable hooking up into relays and doing things like that. But again, I tend to find it's a lot easier than people think it is. It's it's a little bit more complex than Legos, but it is very similar. It's a lot of pre-built modules. Follow the steps and you'll more than likely end up with something that works. So.
And do you have instructions on your website for the soldering, or is there a different place to find that?
So for Fermentrack itself, for all of the installation for Fermentrack, we do have instructions. There are videos at fermentrack.com. I also have links to GitHub on fermentrack.com. And on GitHub, I have documentation for the ESP8266 BrewPi controller, as well as instructions on how to go about assembling some of the boards. One of the things that we've got for that controller that I have available is pre-built PCB, or not pre-built, sorry, pre-designed circuit boards. So a lot of the smaller fiddly bits that you might have to solder together, if you get one of those circuit boards, you can pretty easily then get everything else assembled around it.
And those circuit boards are pretty inexpensive, right?
Yeah. So the company that I use to get those printed up, I think they charge about $8 for 5, something like that.
Okay.
There's a number of other fabs that you can go to, fabrication houses that you can go to. And those fabrication houses may charge less than that, depending on what it is how many you're trying to get built.
Okay. And other components or things like, other than relays, the plugs, you obviously need temperature probes, right?
Yep.
And
temperature probes. Yeah. You can get away with one, but if you really want to get the full power of the BrewPi controller, you need at least 2. I mean, a full build for a BrewPi ESP8266 based controller, you'd need one LCD screen, one ESP8266, one of those PCBs, a relay, an outlet, a bunch of wires, some wire nuts, some kind of power supply for the actual microcontroller. All in all, I'd say generally a build, like all of the parts included, tend to cost about $20 to $25. The main variable, honestly, is the enclosure that you put it in. I've seen people stick it in cigar boxes. I've seen people. I use a 3D printed enclosure. I've seen people put it inside of project boxes that you can get from Amazon. There's a ton of different options.
Yeah, mine particularly sitting in a project box.
Nothing wrong with that. That's the way to do it.
And covered with a pan because it's on my back porch, so it doesn't get rained on. It's like,
oh goodness,
it's so ghetto, but it works and it works well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Can't complain about that.
What are you working on any other projects than Fermentrack? I know you got a new job, so are you working on anything new?
So the latest project that I released is actually Tiltbridge. It is a ESP32 based, so more modern, slightly more modern chip than the ESP8266. It's based on the ESP32, and what it's designed to do is to take the Bluetooth signal that's in a tilt hydrometer and basically change that over to Wi-Fi. It has an integrated display, some other stuff. That one got released earlier this year. Then separate from that, I also have a port that I'm working on of the BrewPi firmware to the ESP32. More to prove that it can be done than for any other reason. In all honesty, the ESP8266 is more than powerful enough for most uses, so there's no real reason to spend more money on the ESP32. And then the other main project that I've been working on is trying to get support for the modern line of firmware into the ESP8266 port of the of BrewPi. So this is some of the control benefits that came from that came with the Spark implementation of the BrewPi. Get those ported over to the ESP8266 as well.
And that Spark implementation does things like full brewery, so like you could do mash temperatures and things like that as well, right? Is that what you're trying to do, or just some of the different fermentation side?
Less with that, more with the fermentation side. I know, like, for example, like one of the big projects that Elco's in the process of coming out with, in fact, I think it's supposed to be out any day now, is BrewBlocks, which is his brewery controller. And in all honesty, I mean, I've had conversations with the guy, very, very nice, very helpful. But if you're interested at all in trying to get a brewery controller built out, definitely it's a project to look into. For me, I'm mostly looking at it from the perspective of how can I use this for fermentation control as opposed to for brewery control.
Yeah, same here. Yeah. Any beers you're brewing right now?
Sadly, no. I actually just picked up the stuff to do, of all things, a Yuengling clone. I figured that so we're going to a Great American Beer Festival at the beginning of October, and I figured if I was going to have no interaction whatsoever with the beer for a while, I might as well go ahead and try my hand at lagering something. I've for all my work with fermentation controllers, I don't think I've successfully brewed a lager that I've wanted to drink. So figure it's about time to make another attempt. But But yeah.
Awesome. I'm actually in Denver, and I will be at Great American Beer Festival as well. So
Perfect.
yeah,
You gonna be there on Saturday?
I am going to be there on Saturday. I'm there with my whole homebrew club. We'll have to definitely hook up.
Definitely. I'll see you then.
Yes. Let's say I'm a new user. Let's say this is I'm trying to get one going. What are the common issues you see people run into with a Fermentrack install?
With the Fermentrack install itself, honestly, not too many. So thankfully, one of the nice things is that as we've had people run into problems in the past, we've tried to build the script out in such a way that it provides feedback to the user to explain what it is might be going wrong. I think one of the biggest problems that we tend to see is once you've got Fermentrack installed, actually connecting the controller that you're using. Again, Fermentrack is designed, it has integrated controller flash support so that you can flash Wi-Fi firmware, you can flash serial firmware based on whatever hardware you have, and then get that pretty easily hooked into Fermentrack itself. I think one of the biggest issues people tend to run into is if you're doing something like flashing Wi-Fi firmware, you're going to have to do some setup after you get the firmware flash. So Fermentrack will get you 80% of the way there, but there are a few steps that need to be done at the end in order to then actually get that loaded into Fermentrack. Same thing is true with regards to serial controllers. Once you get a serial controller flash, you still need to go through the process of getting it set up. Fermentrack will try and guide you through that and try and give you input as to how to go about doing it. But you're going to have to follow those steps, or else it's not going to ultimately work.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Any other common issues you see?
Not really, honestly. I think that for the most part, it's been a lot of the common issues that we found, and one of the refrains that I keep repeating over and over is if it's confusing, it's a bug. Usability is key with Fermentrack, and it is one of the main principles in its design. If something is hard to use, if something is confusing, if something is causing a lot of issues, then even if the feature is working as it theoretically should be, the fact that it's hard to use is in and of itself an issue and is something that needs to be fixed. And to that end, one thing that I would highly recommend is anyone out there that is using Fermentrack, is interested in Fermentrack, that builds it out, tries it out. If you have any concerns, if you have anything that you are sitting there and using and thinking, hey, this could be done better, or hey, this is a feature I wish Fermentrack had, reach out, either open an issue on GitHub, reach out via Homebrew Talk forums is a place that I hang out, reach out on Reddit. More than happy to have a conversation about it and try and see if we can get it fixed or get that new feature added.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to really speak with me and talk about Fermentrack. I know that this is an open source project. You're not really making any money at this, so it is something that you're doing out of the kindness of your heart. And as a home brewer, I totally appreciate it, and I'm sure others do. So I want to thank you for building such a cool project and thinking about it in a way of usability so that it's approachable to really anyone.
No, thank you, and thank you so much for using it, and thank you for the opportunity to come here and talk about it.
I'd like to thank John for coming on the show and building such a great piece of software like Fermentrack. I'll add links to the show notes, to John's website, and all of the Homebrew Talk forums, so if you need help building your own, you'll know where to go. Homebrewing DIY has a website, and if you want to look at in-depth photos of John's Fermentrack build and get more detailed show notes, head over to our website at homebrewingdiy.beer. That's homebrewingdiy.beer. We're on social media, and you should follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Look for the handle @homebrewingdiy. And then last, if you think giving away a show for free is a great business model and it's something you'd like to support, please head on over to anchor.fm/homebrewingdiy/support and help keep the show on the air. Well, that's it for this week, and we'll see you next on Homebrewing DIY.